Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Speaking today is going to be Damien Martina. He's Head of Sales and Marketing at Brawley. Brawley's recently become our partner. They provide a brilliant social media records management tool, and Damien will give you a bit of an introduction to that later on. If you have any questions, please send those through via the messaging function, and I'll be moderating those. I'm going to hand it over now to Damien, who's going to speak on the evolution of customer service engagement and its implications for your organization.
Thanks, Harmony. Thanks for the introduction. Everybody, it's as Harmony said, my name's Damien Martina. I'm the Head of Sales and Marketing at Brawley. On screen now are my contact details, so if you do want to sort of follow up with some additional information, you can obviously do that through Mictish or through my details there. My phone's never more than a metre away from me, much to the dismay of my wife, so please feel free to call me whenever you'd like. And we're recently become an international organisation, so we're used to getting phone calls at all hours. For those of you that haven't heard of Brawley, just a very quick introduction as to who we are and what we do. Brawley is a Melbourne-based organisation. We provide a lot of services to government across all levels, so federal, state and local government. Brawley is a software platform based in, hosted on AWS in Sydney, so we keep all of our data sovereignty in Australia. All of our product is designed and developed in Australia, and we're very proud of that. And the bottom photo on the right hand side there, that's our team being very happy of being at work. I'm not in that photo, so which is really nice, because on landing, I'm sure my knee would have popped out, and I would have had to go and see the physio. But yeah, so that's what sort of what we do and how we do it. I want to try to make sure that this this webinar is as interactive as possible. I don't like hearing my voice for a good part of an hour, but it'd be great to get some interaction with you guys as well. So if you could go to a website, https://brawley.com.au, and just follow the instructions there to create an account. It'll ask you for your name and email address. I give you my guarantee that we won't be spamming you. The reason we do this is to make sure that we can moderate some of the answers that come through. And just to give everybody a little bit of time to go through that and to see how we're tracking with connecting these. The first sort of question is, if you're going to vacation on Mars, you're going to be on a spaceship for a year, but you'll be asleep, and you're going to be there for 6 months, and you are able to take one item with you. What would you take? And when you're answering this, just be aware that it's only one word. So if you come up with 2 words, it actually won't make sense on the screen. So hopefully I'll give you guys a little bit of time to go there, follow those instructions, and we'll be able to sort of see how people are tracking with that. And while you're doing that, I'll sort of give you a bit of introduction into the conversation that we're going to be having now. And it's mostly in relation to how social media has really changed the customer service engagement. And what does that mean for both the citizens that we're dealing with, or people that we're dealing with if it's an organisation, and what does it also mean to the organisation itself, from a delivery of service perspective, but also a security perspective as well. And what should we be thinking about when we're starting to implement these strategies, and what parts of the business should we be talking to when we're going through that? Okay, so we're starting to see a few things come through. So we've got a couple of 7 results in there. I'd like to say that actually this is the first time I've ever seen pancetta in there. I'm not sure who's going to take a test. Maybe somebody who really liked university and they're sort of hanging for some more tests. I think it might have just been a test, actually. Hair straightener, I'm assuming. That's a cool one. Wine is always a popular one. So wine and chocolate. a very, very common one there. So sounds like we're going to have a bit of fun, and somebody who really wants to make sure that they look good when they're in on Mars for 6 months. So feel free again just to go on to https://brolly.com.au because we'll be using that shortly in a couple of other questions. So thank you very much, everybody, for going on to that. As I mentioned, so we're going to talk a little bit about how is social media changing customer service engagement and its strategies, striking the balance between transparent and private, that's interesting. It should be public and private communication, not transparent and private. Protecting your organization when you're going through this. Why archiving all this information is important, and some top tips in here. And a quick overview about Brolly and the platform and how it sort of can help through that. And we'll actually just be sharing some more news with you at the end of the conference as well. So make sure you stay online to hear that. Okay, so the first sort of poll that we'll go through is, do you currently or are you looking at archiving your social media? Yes, no, maybe, and in the response I've actually written maybe, but I don't really know. A lot of the times when we do ask this question, people actually don't know if it's happening, if it's not happening, or if they need to. So it'll be interesting to see where we are with that. We're starting to see that maybe I don't really know has shot out in the front. So I think it's one of those things that we sort of assume happens, but we don't necessarily know who owns the requirement or who owns the responsibility of it. But as users of social media, especially within an organization, we should have a fairly good understanding as to whether it's happening or not. Typically when I do ask this question at conferences, and we actually just got back from the Social Media for Government Summit in WA, we ask these questions and we tend to get about 10% of organisations have a very clear understanding that they do. And when we're talking about government, it's a little bit of a concern, those sort of numbers. But that's exactly why we're doing these type of sessions, is to bring out the importance of what this is. Cool. So most people don't really know. We've got a few no's in there and one yes. So congratulations to that one person that said yes. Thumbs up. Cool. So if we get into how social media is changing customer service engagement strategies, and it might be worth just going through a little bit of the history of social media platforms. Social media has just become so much of our life at the moment that we sometimes don't really take a view as to what's happened in the past. And it's a fairly recent history. So in 2003, LinkedIn launched, and their logo was very early 2000s, late 90s. And that's when Face Mash launches. So if you've seen the movie about Facebook, you sort of probably know the history of where Facebook came from. So Mark Zuckerberg in his university dorm made up this idea of Face Mash, and that's when it launched. So 2005, it became Facebook, and we also saw the launch of YouTube. Which is really interesting. YouTube's been around for quite a long time, but hasn't necessarily seen a lot of engagement until recently. 2006, Twitter launched. Their logo looking like some green jello. That's when that launched, and then in 2010 we saw Instagram come out. Where we are now, 9 years after the last launch of the major platform, one of the major platforms, all of those logos are now become very much part of our life. We see them, we know exactly what they are. The brand recognition within social media platforms is enormous, and all of those brands now are identified by their logos or even just a letter. So it's very much part of what we do every day. Some interesting points here is also that there's been no huge platforms that have launched in effectively the last 10 years. So we are always constantly looking at what is the next platform that is going to be used by organisations to communicate. If you were to walk into a government organisation 10 years ago and said that a lot of their communication was going to be done via Facebook, I think you'd get a lot of raised eyebrows. And those eyebrows are probably the similar sort of raised eyebrows if you have the conversation today around using things like Snapchat. But who knows what the future holds for the engagements. And a lot of that really depends on where are our customers going, and where do they want us to communicate with them. And as the customers go to those platforms, effectively we need to go to those platforms as well. So if we really sort of look at Facebook as far as the history of Facebook and how it's changed, and therefore how have we changed our behaviour to work with Facebook. Back in about 2005, there was a lot of the launch of Facebook, and it was very much a personal page. But from the mid to late 2000s, the opportunity to provide tailored content to customers grew, and those networks really evolved from being personal platforms into public and highly curated spaces. And push tailored content to relevant and potential and current customers. So there was a lot more information being shared through this newsfeed type of engagement. And then in 2015, private messages for pages was enabled by Facebook. And that meant that we could start to answer questions in real time, but also run highly specific and cost-effective advertising campaigns to target audiences, which really meant that the private message space was starting to increase. And consumers could then follow their favourite brands and keep informed about their communities through social media, allowing businesses to remain front of mind without the need of expensive media blitzes. So a really effective way of getting information out. And social media was and still is a place where organisations can easily reach millions of people. But as we saw that organisations started to embrace social media for customer care, the more prevalent online interactions became, and the more visible they became. Both the good and bad become visible. So customers now have the power to reach the same audience with a positive or negative influence as the brand does. And for a growing number of consumers, there's an expectation that these issues will be resolved in a timely manner through social media networks, as they also offer the greatest convenience to customers when they're engaging with a brand, and whether that brand is sort of local government, state government, or a brand in its traditional sort of format. So to give you a bit of an understanding as to some of the numbers there, consumers are now aware that they've got a public voice, and social media has increasingly become used for complaints resolution, with over 2/3 of respondents from a survey called Smart Insights indicated that they expect companies to offer customer service via their channels. And a recent study found that over half the respondents preferred social media communications to engage with brands rather than traditional methods such as emails, phones, or web chats. And that's hardly surprising when you think that why would you send an email that could be ignored when you could set a tweet that is going to gain social leverage and public exposure? And why wait for customer service to be open at 2 o'clock in the morning when you're lying awake thinking about something, when you can just send them a message? And why wait on hold when you can just send a question via social media and view a response in your own time at your own convenience? And so social media usage increases globally, and organisations are leveraging social media platforms to not only engage with their peers and favourite brands, but also to organise with all other organisations such as federal, state and local governments. So the most, you might know these stats, but I'll just share them with you anyway. The most popular times for engaging on social media are in the evening and the first thing in the morning. So 61% of people use social media in the evening and 59% of them use them first thing in the morning. The interesting thing about that is that both of those times are outside of traditional business hours, indicating that the flexibility that is being offered by social media platforms to access companies at convenience time actually increases its appeal. I don't think you want to know where people are normally when they're using these social media platforms. The statistics show that the most popular rooms are the lounge room and the bedroom. That's where most of the social media engagement happens. But anything up to 20% actually gets used in the smallest room of the house. So when people are sending messages, that's probably where they are. We're seeing these numbers have come through a selected customer base that we've used in Brawley, mostly around local government. And we've seen a significant increase in both the volume of overall posts. So from January 2016, these selected organisations used 51,000 records a month, and now those numbers have more than doubled. And that other number from 15 to 55,000 is the number of private messages. So you can see both an increase in the overall number of records that are being used in social media, but a massive increase in those private messages, which tends to show that organisations are both listening to private messages that are coming through, but also the consumers are very much going towards those platforms. So the private message functions within the social media platforms. You see there's a bit of a spike there in March of 2017. That's in relation to some emergency situations that we tend to have in January with fires and floods, and it always sort of bumps up social media engagement. So as we've got higher social media engagement, that we're dealing with an explosion of records, and especially as organisations open up chat features like Facebook Messenger and Twitter. Nearly 9 in 10 Australians use social media, and that's gone up from last year, and it's been an increasing number for the last 5 years, according to the census reports. 34% of people check their social media at least 5 times a day, and those aged between 18 and 39 use social media the most frequently. But the interesting thing is that across all age brackets, so the age brackets are everything from 18 to 79, at least 2/3 of people check their social media accounts at least once a week, which makes social media truly a cross-generational method of communication. So whilst this offers a lot of value in terms of reach, brand building potential, and advertising opportunities, the two-way nature of communication also means that organisations need to be aware of the digital landscape more than ever, and a failure to develop a robust social media strategy can result in significant reputational damage. 90% of people say that social media see social media as a way of directly engaging with businesses. Engagement and communication strategies have to develop rapidly around that. So we don't rely anymore on long-winded press releases, and we don't expect our customers to bombard us with emails and phone calls in the hope of a timely response. We're engaging all of that through social media. So the perception of social media as a tool strictly for brand awareness has changed and is continuing to change. It's now become a first point of contact for customers, integrating with traditional call centres to provide better customer service outcomes. And with so much information now it's being shared digitally, there are occasions where postal business may not be appropriate for public consumption, or may require follow-up that includes sharing of personal information. So this is where we start to see things move into that into the private communication space. And so it's up to us to really make sure that we have methods in place to balance the conversations that are that are taking place in the public space, i.e. transparent communications, and those that are having taken place in those private spaces. So there's another question for you all. So does your organisation currently use private messaging services? So apologies for all the abbreviations. I know that's Rule 101 of engagements is to not use jargon, but private messaging is a bit of a long phrase, and so it's a lot easier to put in a heading PM. So that's what we do mean about PM services. So do we use private messaging services? And I've just noticed that the fonts here are really difficult to see. 92% of them are saying, I think that's yes, actually. It is yes. Both the colours and my eyesights are being tested here. So a lot of organisations are using private messaging by the looks of this, which is excellent. And I think for probably the same reasons that we've sort of covered off. That's where our customers are. That's where their expectation of us sharing information and providing feedback and support is going. People don't want to wait on hold anymore. They'd rather send you a message on Facebook private messaging. So businesses generally follow there's a couple of reasons why we do this, is to availability expectations and the building of trust. And in the past few years, social media evolution has seen significant rise in engagement via private channels. Internet users are increasingly expecting businesses to become available to them around the clock, and they place trust in those businesses that offer the ability to directly engage with them. In a survey, over 50% of respondents agree or strongly agree that businesses should be responsive to them 24/7. So I'm not sure what that actually means to the poor people that need to work in these customer service engagements, but they do expect this resolution. And that's part of the reasons why we're starting to see the adoption of bots in a lot of organisations, so that the consumer starts to see some form of engagement, whether it's an automated engagement or a one-on-one personalised engagement. And most of those people are on Facebook Messenger. That still seems to be the most popular private messaging space platform. And they see about 1.3 billion users using Facebook Messenger per month. Now, 1.3 billion seems like a big number. And if you're anything like me, these numbers get thrown around. And it sort of makes you think, well, really, what is 1.3 billion? To put that into some sort of context, that is just shy of the population of China. So just shy of the population of China are actually on Facebook Messenger every month. So when we start to think about what does your typical phone engagement and email engagement look like when you're comparing it to the engagements that we see on Facebook Messenger. So the average open rate for an email in Australia is just over 20%. So HubSpot did a research piece and they found that the open rate on Facebook Messenger was just over 80%. So it's a huge difference. And there's also a large increase in click-through rates compared to email. So aside from the obvious privacy benefits, private messaging is also viewed as a more personal way of communicating, and people are more likely to effectively respond to messaging from a business. And those engagements also see those individuals rating that communication method as either excellent or very good compared to what the conversations are on phones. So we're seeing both not only a very high level of volume and a high level of engagement, but also a high level of satisfaction when people do communicate with us through Facebook Messenger. And so the other thing that's really interesting about private messaging in the social media space is that organisations are now being measured in the public sphere. So as soon as you go onto Facebook, you'll be able to see how often and how quickly can you get a message responded to. So it's not only just an opportunity to answer questions. We can also set the expectations that your questions are going to be answered thoroughly, honestly, credibly, and within that reasonable time frame. Because if you don't, just be prepared that screenshots might find their way into the public sphere if we don't actually reply to these things correctly. So letting customers know when they can anticipate a reply can ease their concerns around the timeliness, around where they can get the reply back. And part of what we would recommend is that you have automated messages for those that do contact you outside of your organisation's business hours, just to let them know that will be responded, and to set an expectation as to when they could get a response. So with the increased amounts of private conversations happening on social media, the other thing that we need to worry about is how do we protect our organisations if a private complaint becomes public, or if misinformation about your organisation goes viral. So protecting our organisation is really important, and that's where we really need to look at the processes that we've got in place when individuals communicate with our organisations. And for years we've had situations where the organisation's communicated with the outside public by hard copy materials, phones and support, website and email. And now we're starting to see more and more of this social media posts and engagements happening. And we've always had a methodology for archiving or keeping records for all of those methods of communication. We all know that when you ring a government department, the phone call is going to be recorded, and we hear that as a message. We know that if you email somebody, the organisation is probably going to keep a copy of those emails for records keeping purposes. But when we communicate with an organisation, be it a government organisation or not, there's a little bit of doubt as to whether or not those records will be kept, and for what purposes will they be kept. But if we start to look at the advice from subject matter experts across Australia, it becomes very clear that all of these departments and offices talk that a social media record is in fact a public record. So under the Public Records Act, any record that's received or generated by a public somebody in public office is deemed to be a public record, and all of these departments and offices have guidances that sort of follow the same suggestions. What's interesting about some of the differences in here is that each of the states do talk about keeping social media. The levels in which they talk about keeping social media sometimes varies, but they very rarely say how you go about doing this. So things like talking about keeping images, keeping external website links, keeping metadata varies very much from state to state. So that's really where sort of Brawley comes in. And we've spent the last few years making sure that we work very closely with the National Archives and state bodies to better understand what those requirements are, and provide recommendations to organisations how they can protect themselves. And it's really critical that we do make sure that we understand these regulations and advice, and that we make sure that we keep these records as well. So why is archiving important? And to give you guys a bit of some top tips, archiving is becoming more and more important in the social media space for a few reasons. Firstly, is we're seeing more and more engagement on social media. It's a platform that's being used by more Australians more often, and we're seeing those engagements increasing all the time. We're seeing more records in there that are coming into the social media space. More requests for this information is coming through, and the complexity of these requests and the data that we're holding is becoming more and more complex almost every day. So when we're talking about more engagement, We're seeing businesses and organisations using social media to provide support and advice in both the private and the public space. We're seeing alerts and warnings coming through, especially in Australia this time of year. We do see a lot of information being shared by the emergency services. This picture was actually a tweet that inspired Brolly back in December 2015. Our founder, Nathan, was inborn at the time, and this tweet sort of provided him the impotence of thinking about how social media impacts people in their real lives. We also see customer support being handled via social media consistently in both the private and public space, where people will post a question and the organisation will get back to you. We also see policy announcements happening on social media as well. So this policy announcement made by Daniel Andrews was pretty important, because it was announcing the Melbourne train lines, underground train lines, which at the time was Australia's largest infrastructure project. And it was announced on social media in its first instance, rather than a press announcement. Daniel Andrews tweeted about it, which is really interesting. And we also are offering a higher level of community engagement. I love this post with the City of Melbourne, where an individual has posted a photo, and the City of Melbourne has come back and said, "We love you too." If you look back 5 years or think back 5 years, do you think that anybody would have actually said to any council, "We love you"? And here is a picture. So that's a really great indication that social media does help us change the perception of what we do. So yes, I've showed you these numbers before, but we are seeing across the board a higher number of records being created on social media, almost doubling the number of records that we've seen from 3 years ago. So there's more records being created, and they're being created not only by the organisation, but also by individuals that are engaging with our organisations. In that previous example about the council, content is being created by the people we're engaging with, and there's content that can be quite important as well. And we're seeing more requests come through, and the reasons we're seeing more requests of data are exactly the same reasons you would see requests for other forms of information, either through a freedom of information request, privacy, or audits. But lately we're also seeing a fair few royal commissions come through, and they can certainly request information from social media. So the reasons we keep records in social media are exactly the same reasons we would keep records of any other form of communication with an organisation. And the trend of freedom of information has increased as well. Now, these numbers were taken from requests that are just to federal organisations or federal departments, and they're only specific to social media. It's not that these numbers do not include where the social media request has also been as a result of a more overarching freedom of information, but the trend is still very much increasing. An interesting thing about the last 2 years with this is that the freedom of information requests for Twitter have actually decreased, whereas the numbers for Facebook have increased to a much larger extent. Part of the reason for that is departments and most government organisations are moving away from Twitter from a private messaging perspective, and preferring Facebook for that. And the requests are coming as a result of a lot of acts that specifically talk about keeping of data, but are also talking around social media data as well. Freedom of information, even the Evidence Act does talk around making sure that you keep a record of information, but also making sure that you can prove the accuracy of that information as well, where that's why we're keeping records. We want to make sure that we do keep all that metadata so you can prove that the information you're keeping is actually true and correct. The complexity of social media is really interesting. The number of times I hear people say, "Hey, it's only a tweet, how hard can it be?" There's a lot of information that you're trying to keep, and trying to keep those information in something like this would be an absolute nightmare. And this is actually a real example of some data that we've seen that was being kept as a log of social media engagement. But part of the reason this looks so messy is that the amount of data we're trying to keep is quite complicated and changes consistently. And this isn't just something that we see once and doesn't have a real impact. So in November 2017, Christina Keneally was being asked some questions about her social media account, and 3 months of it seemed to have disappeared. So what she actually did to resolve this was she shared a Google link with a history of those tweets, but still it was missing over a month's worth of data. And this is actually a link, and this is a screenshot of the actual link itself. So her answer to these questions around how are you archiving was very much a manual answer. So that sort of did bring into account the question of accuracy of the information that was being kept. And we know that if you're doing something manually by human, it's going to be about 10% wrong. That's just the way that we key data in. So to give you a little bit of a view as to the complexity of a social media post, so when you do see a tweet that's 140 characters long, there's a huge amount of information in that. So there's the account information, obviously the activity, date and time that it was created. The post itself, so the words you see, are actually a very, very small part of the social media post. The amount of media that's attached to records these days is increasing through both video, photos, Facebook Live, for instance. All of those media are now being used more and more often, and the analytics that sits underneath that. So when you press like, when you have the little smiley face emoticons, that's all data that we should be keeping. And then underneath all of that is the metadata. So in Facebook, there's about 300 fields of metadata that can be collected. Everything from posting information to did it come from an automated posting platform such as Hootsuite or Sprout Social, to obviously the links that you're collecting as well. So that's just one post. And to make things even more complicated, every time a comment comes in, that structure is effectively the same as what the original post structure was as well. So we're trying to keep all of those records and then trying to keep how do those records interact with each other. So making sure that we keep the context of all that information is really important, because without the context, it's just a message and who saw it. To give you an example of what happens when things go wrong, so back in 2017 seemed to be a pretty bad year for social media. Mike Baird, who was the Premier of New South Wales, resigned on Twitter. Mr. Baird was a great advocate of social media in his professional life. He had 65,000 followers on his Twitter page, and when he resigned, true to form, he resigned on Twitter, and then he deleted his Twitter account. The Australian asked him if those accounts had been, if those records had been kept, and the Department of Premier and Cabinet and State Records couldn't confirm if those records were actually kept or not kept. And there was a little bit of backwards and forwards as to who should have kept this. Was it the state archiving body? Was it National Archives? Was it the Department of Premier or Cabinet? Was it Mike Baird himself? So there was a lot of this backwards and forwards going through, and all of that played out on social media and traditional media. So there's a lot of finger pointing going on as to whose responsibility it was and who actually did it. And the department, so the Department of Premier and Cabinet actually refused to say whether or not they were being kept. And they responded with Mr. Baird's Twitter account is actually a matter of his own personal records. But when the National Archives got involved, they were pretty clear in saying that these records, if they've been, these accounts, if they're being used to carry out ministerial responsibilities, are considered Commonwealth records. So, the fallout of deleting your Twitter page is, sometimes I use the example of paramount of walking into a library with a can of petrol and a match and lighting public records on fire. The fact that we're creating these things digitally now means that we really need to be sure that we're keeping them digitally and we're keeping them correctly all the time. So some of our top tips. First of all, just be aware of the constantly evolving policy and guidelines. So what is a definition of a record and how we keep it? Some of those things are within policy and guidelines in each of the states, and we're more than happy to share that with you if you need some help with that. Understand how that translates in the one-on-one communication and private messaging space. And just be aware of the types of conversations that are being had in that public space and what their importance is. Should you be keeping those records or those conversations? Because once you do delete a private message thread, in most instances, it's gone. And if you're not keeping those records and other people have kept a screenshot of it, how are you protecting your organisation from that? The other one of our top tips is don't place reliance on a social media channel's functionality of archiving. Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter have a native archiving function. They call it archiving, but what it really is a snapshot of where that record is today. So you can imagine that if you've edited a post or deleted a post in the past, and that is in social media at the moment, either as a missing record or a finalised record, you've lost all of that of the history of where that was created, where it was edited, or potentially even deleted. LinkedIn has gone a step further with this, and if you look at their terms of service, and I'm sure that all of you that have got a LinkedIn page have spent hours agonising over the LinkedIn service agreements. It actually says in there that they're not a storage service. Our expectation is that a lot of these platforms will start to remove data beyond a certain date. Haven't seen it as yet, but it's only a matter of time. And if you think about what their business process is, it wouldn't be unusual for them to do that. Our next tip is don't place reliance on a manual process. Manual processes don't stand up to rigor and have little value to an organisation. So if you think about that spreadsheet that Christina Keneally created, there's a lot of doubt as to the accuracy of that. And so doubt of accuracy normally comes in as a result of not having an automated process in place. The other reason why you don't want a manual process is that your team will hate you for it. I could think of nothing worse than having to archive every single message that comes in and out of a social media post and trying to capture 300 fields of metadata. It's going to be quite a daunting task, and people won't like it. So social media is complicated, and don't let people tell you otherwise. The relationship between a post and another post is really, really important, and it's quite complicated. So don't underestimate that complexity. The other thing is we suggest that you do facilitate moderation of your social media accounts if required. So social media is a very public arena, obviously, and everything that we do there is in the public eye. And sometimes we get messages or posts that aren't that could be in breach of our acceptable use policy, which we should be deleting. And if you do delete those or moderate those records, you want to make sure that you keep a full history as to why you've deleted that, because the person who's posted that record could probably come back to you and say, hey, I didn't breach your acceptable use policy. You're just deleting it because you didn't like what I wrote. And that was actually the case that happened with Westpac a few years ago. There was a big backlash as to Westpac deleting some records on their social media page, and the issue wasn't necessarily the fact that what caused those comments. It was the fact that they were trying to moderate their page without having evidence as to why they deleted those records. So which sort of brings us up into our last top tip. Be clear with what your acceptable use policy is and what your record policy is in both the public and the private space. You'll sometimes see on a Facebook page an acceptable use policy. What we're seeing more and more often now is a records keeping policy that's defined within that acceptable use. In much the same way that when you ring a government department, you hear the fact that it's going to be recorded, and that's done for a variety of reasons, one of which is the Telecommunications Act. But what it also means is that the public are now understanding that the conversations that are being had will be recorded. And you probably will see what's called, and I call it the speed camera effect. You know that there's a speed camera around somewhere, so you start to slow down. In social media, if you know that your records are being recorded, you're probably going to be a little bit more careful about what you write and how you write it. So that could actually help temper sort of spiteful engagements, and your customer service team will be really thankful to you about that. So just before we sort of got a few minutes more, I'll give you a quick overview of what Brolly does and sort of how it helps. Brolly was created to help government organisations mostly to keep public records, and it's a software platform that's hosted on AWS. And the implementation of it is as simple as going to a login page for your social media. So it's very easy. We provide services to all levels of government across Australia, from councils to large federal organisations, utilities, and we're starting to see a lot of engagement within education as well. So what we keep is every engagement that happens on social media for accounts that are connected to Brolly. We will keep every single transaction that comes in there, whether it's a creation, edit, a deletion, a share, or a comment, in both the private and public space. We will keep a copy of all the media that's attached. If there's a video file, we will keep that. If it's a picture that's been uploaded either by the organisation or by an individual outside of the organisation, we will keep those things as well. It's all done in real time, so you never have to worry about a manual process. It's all hosted in Australia, so data sovereignty doesn't become an issue. So that's a very, very quick overview of what we do. The reason I wanted to sort of say that is because sometimes social media can, especially when you start thinking about records keeping, can be a bit daunting. What we would suggest is certainly have a look at what the policy is and what you should be doing. If Brolly can help you, great. If we don't end up helping you, please just do something about it. So that's what we want to try to make sure, is that people understand what the requirements are. And to sort of help that a little bit, McTish are going to be hosting an event with us as well around records management. What we'll cover off there is a little bit more in-depth stuff in relation to the legislative requirements, the challenges around social media record keeping, and how to tackle social media records keeping management. We're going to be running that in the first week of April, which will be here before you know it. So if you're interested in registering for that, go to mctish.com.au/events, register your interest, and we'll keep you informed as to when that event is coming up. But as I said, it will be the first week in April. So hopefully we've been able to share a little bit of information with you, highlight some of the reasons why social media is becoming more and more important in the customer service engagement. A lot of that is in relation to our expectations of the public's expectations of what we're delivering to them. It's a very trusted platform. People expect us to engage in both a time-efficient manner, but also providing them accurate information. But we also need to make sure that we're protecting our organisation and the staff that work in our organisation that are sharing these pieces of information with the public. So it can be a little bit daunting, but please, if I can share one thing with you, just keep calm about it and keep engaging. Our people expect us to provide these types of information on social media. The last thing we want to do is scare people into saying, don't use it as a platform anymore. It is the platform that our consumers are expecting us to engage in. The benefits of social media are increasing exponentially every year, so keep engaging on it. So
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Damien. Much appreciated. That was a great overview. So if anyone has any additional questions, I'll stay on to moderate those. And if I don't have an answer for you immediately, my McTish or Brawley will come back to you with an answer on that. And feel free, like Damien said, to register your interest for that upcoming event in Brisbane. Excellent. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great afternoon.